Tonight, as the city outside drifts into sleep, I invite you to stay for a while, to wander with me through the dusk of time. We'll listen to the stories that history tried to bury, the moments that never made it into textbooks, and the secrets that still hum softly beneath the dust of centuries. Because sometimes, the past doesn't speak in thunder, it speaks in whispers. After sunset, when we think of the 19th century, we often imagine progress steam trains slicing through fog, factories lighting up the night, the world humming with invention. But beneath that glow, another kind of fire was burning quieter, softer, born not from machines, but from human hearts that had grown tired of being invisible. The Industrial Revolution was supposed to be humanity's triumph. And in a way, it was. It connected cities, built fortunes, and pulled millions from the farms into a new kind of life. But inside those towering mills of Manchester and the sooty streets of Birmingham, the price of progress was being paid in broken hands and sleepless eyes. Imagine it for a moment. The year is 1835. The morning mist still clings to the cobblestones as the factory whistle screams across the dawn. Barefoot children hurry through puddles, their breath turning white in the cold. Inside, machines roar like beasts, spinning cotton and hope into profit. 12 hours, 14 hours, 6 days a week, and still, for many, hunger waits at home. They called this the Age of Enlightenment, but for the workers who built it, it was an age of silence. A silence so deep that when someone finally dared to speak, the world trembled. It began not with soldiers or kings, but with a few unlikely dreamers. A Scottish mill owner named Robert Owen, who believed that wealth meant nothing if the people who created it lived in misery. A French thinker, Saint-Simon, who dared to imagine a society led not by birthright, but by wisdom and compassion. And later, two men, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who would take these murmurs of compassion and forge them into something powerful enough to reshape nations. But before all the manifestos and revolutions, there was simply a question whispered between workers in the smoke and soot. Is this really what progress is supposed to feel like? No one wrote it down, but everyone knew what it meant. The machines were faster, the cities brighter, but the human soul, it was growing thin. History often remembers power kings, emperors, conquests. But this was the story of the powerless, finding their voice. A story that began in the dim corners of taverns and the narrow alleys of cities where the air tasted of iron and dreams. At night, when the factories fell silent, workers would gather a candle between them, a crust of bread shared, and the smallest spark of hope that maybe the world didn't have to be this way, that maybe work could have dignity, that maybe their children could know a kind of life that didn't end in exhaustion. Those whispers spread like wind through Europe. They reached writers, philosophers, teachers, people who could turn sorrow into words and words into movement. Slowly, the idea began to take shape, that society should serve everyone, not just the few, that the measure of progress wasn't how much gold was hoarded, but how much suffering was eased. It was called socialism, a name simple enough to fit on a pamphlet, but vast enough to hold a dream. At first, it was laughed at. Naive, said the powerful. Dangerous, said the rich. But ideas, once spoken aloud, have a way of surviving mockery. They linger. They wait. By mid-century, Europe was trembling again, not from war this time, but from something deeper, the awakening of conscience. People began to notice what they had once ignored. Newspapers wrote about child labor. Artists painted the weary faces of factory workers. Poets, once obsessed with kings and glory, started writing about hunger, about injustice, about hope. And somewhere in the quiet of a London library, Marx and Engels sat together, shaping what they called the Communist Manifesto. It was bold, even reckless, a declaration that history itself was a struggle between those who owned and those who labored. To them, socialism wasn't just compassion. It was the inevitable direction of humanity. But their words, were not thunder. They were whispers, the same whispers that had begun decades earlier, now written in ink instead of breath. Still, this story, the story of socialism, was never really about theory or politics. It was about people. It was about the young woman who stitched until her fingers bled, the man who coughed himself to death in a coal mine, the child who grew up believing that life was nothing but work. When we say socialism changed the world, it didn't happen in a single moment or under a single flag. It began with empathy, one person daring to feel another's pain as their own. That was its quiet revolution. Think of how strange it must have felt at the time to believe that fairness could be built, that kindness could be written into law. It wasn't just political, it was poetic. It was the belief that humanity could do better, that progress could be measured not by machines, but by mercy. And slowly, it began to work its way into the world. Workers demanded shorter hours, not out of laziness, but so they could live. Laws were passed. Children went to school instead of factories. The idea that people deserved rest, education, and health, these were seeds planted by that whisper in the smoke. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even consistent. Some called it socialism, others called it justice. But it changed the rhythm of history. When we look back now, it's easy to see the Industrial Revolution as inevitable, as though it had to unfold exactly as it did. But if you listen closely, beyond the noise of progress, you can still hear the heartbeat of those who asked for something gentler. They didn't want to destroy the world. They wanted to soften it. That's what makes the story of socialism so deeply human. It wasn't born from power, but from exhaustion. It wasn't forged by ambition, but by empathy. It didn't begin in palaces, but in homes lit by a single candle, where someone dared to imagine a kinder tomorrow. Even now, in the hum of our modern world, in the glow of screens and the rush of cities that whisper still lingers, reminding us that the measure of civilization has never been its wealth, but its warmth. And so, before we talk of revolutions and manifestos, of nations and ideologies, we begin here in the smoke and the silence, with the moment humanity remembered its own heart. Because that's where every great story begins. Some stories begin with thunder revolutions, wars, kings losing their crowns, but this one began in silence. In a small room in London, the air thick with the smell of ink and coal, two men sat together, one with eyes like burning coals, the other calm, deliberate, almost gentle. Their names would soon be whispered and cursed across the world: Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They were, in many ways, opposites. Engels was the son of a wealthy German industrialist, a man born among the masters of the New World. Marx was a philosopher, poor and stubborn, a man whose thoughts were too large to fit inside a single lifetime. But destiny, in its strange poetry, brought them together, a man who owned factories and a man who wanted to free the workers inside them. They met in a smoky cafe in Paris in 1844. Outside, the city pulsed with the energy of a restless century. Artists painting dreams, poets chasing liberty, workers filling the streets with songs of protest. Inside, two strangers spoke for hours, their voices low but their words sharp as blades. They spoke not about power, but about fairness. Not about who ruled, but why some must suffer for others to rise. Engels had seen it with his own eyes. The factories in Manchester, where children moved like shadows, where the air was thick with lint and despair. Marx had felt it in his soul, the weight of a system that turned men into machines and dreams into debts. Together, they began to see what few dared to imagine, that the problem wasn't in the hearts of men, but in the structure of the world itself. Marx believed history wasn't a series of accidents, it was a rhythm, a pattern. Civilizations rose and fell not because of heroes or villains, but because of the invisible threads of class and labor. To him, society was a great machine built by the many, owned by the few. And until that changed, history would repeat the same sad song. It was a daring thought, almost dangerous, because it asked a question the powerful had long buried. What if the world could be rewritten? That night in Paris, the two men decided to try. They began to write not poetry, not philosophy, but a call to the heart of humanity. Each line was a whisper turned into a sentence, each sentence a quiet rebellion. When they finally published their work a few years later, it began with words that would echo through centuries. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. But the specter they spoke of was not a ghost of violence or hatred. It was the ghost of empathy, the ancient, forgotten belief that a society's greatness is not measured by its wealth, but by how it treats its poorest. They didn't seek to destroy, but to awaken, to remind the world that behind every factory and fortune stood the hands of those who built it. Their dream was not chaos, but balance, a world where no one ruled simply because they were born to, and no one starved simply because they were not. Yet history is never kind to dreamers. While Marx wrote in libraries and cafes, his own life was a constant struggle against poverty. His family often went hungry. One of his daughters once sold her coat to buy him paper. Engels, the man of privilege, quietly paid his friends' bills, hiding his compassion behind the facade of a businessman. Their partnership became a strange kind of love, a friendship forged in shared belief, one feeding the body, the other feeding the flame. In the quiet of London nights, Marx would write until dawn, his pen scratching across the page like a man racing against time. He saw himself not as a prophet, but as a mirror reflecting the truth of a world that had forgotten how to feel. Engels, meanwhile, walked the factory floors, memorizing the faces of men who had no voice, no rest, no tomorrow. He would later turn those memories into a book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, a work that made Europe tremble. They never commanded armies. They had no palaces, no crowns, no power, only ideas. And yet, ideas are the only things that can't be chained. Their thoughts spread like fire through pamphlets and letters, reaching men and women who had never even seen a book before. In the dim light of tenement rooms, workers began to read slowly, haltingly, words that told them they mattered. That history belonged not to kings or priests, but to them. For the first time, people began to see the world as something that could be changed, not by divine will, but by human hands. And yet, even in their most hopeful moments, Marx and Engels knew how fragile dreams could be. The more they wrote, the more fear they inspired. Governments banned their books, exiled their followers, and whispered their names like curses. But the whisper was already out there. A young man in Italy would read it, a soldier in Russia, a poet in China, a student in Cuba. The words would twist, transform, take root in 1,000 different ways, some gentle, some violent, some noble, some tragic. That was never Marx's plan. His dream was a map, not a sword. He wanted equality, not empire. But history, like wind, never moves in straight lines. In their final years, both men aged quickly. Marx's beard turned white. Engels's laughter grew softer. They watched the world change slowly, unevenly, painfully. Sometimes they wondered if it had been worth it. But perhaps what mattered most was not the revolutions that came later, but the compassion that came first. Because before socialism became a system, it was a heartbeat, a belief that humanity could rise without stepping on its own shadow. It is easy, today, to look back and argue about Marx, to point to the regimes that claimed his name, the tragedies that followed. But that would be like blaming a candle for the darkness around it. Ideas are not what destroy us. The way we wield them does. What Marx and Engels gave the world was not a weapon, but a mirror, one that forced civilization to look at itself, to ask, is this what progress looks like? The answer was never simple, but the question changed everything. And as the two men grew old, still surrounded by papers, debts, and endless letters, they could not have known how deeply their whispers would echo. They did not see the revolutions, the empires, the slogans, but somewhere deep inside, they must have known that once an idea learns to speak, it never truly dies. When Engels buried Marx in a quiet corner of Highgate Cemetery, he spoke softly, his voice trembling not with grief, but with awe. "The greatest living thinker has ceased to think," he said, "but his name will endure through the ages." The London wind carried those words away, across the fog and the factory smoke perhaps, to remind the world that ideas, like souls, cannot be buried. And so, two dreamers, one rich, one poor, left behind not riches or monuments, but something far more dangerous: hope. The kind of hope that teaches us that history isn't written by the powerful, but by those who refuse to stop dreaming. Change never begins with fireworks. It begins with restlessness, with the quiet, collective breath of millions who, one morning, simply decide they have had enough. By the end of the 19th century, Europe was trembling again. The words of Marx and Engels had traveled farther than even they could have dreamed, carried by trains, by whispers, by hunger. In the coffee houses of Paris, in the factories of Berlin, in the frozen fields of Russia, the same question kept returning. If all men are equal in birth, why are some born in chains? For years, the idea of socialism had been just that, an idea. Gentle, almost naive. But the world was growing impatient. Empires were cracking beneath their own weight. The poor filled the streets not with fear anymore, but with purpose. And then, one cold October morning in 1917, a revolution finally answered the whisper with a roar. In Petrograd, the heart of a crumbling Russian empire, workers, soldiers, and peasants gathered under red banners. The Tsar had already fallen, but the people were still starving, the war still raging, the promise of peace still far away. In that chaos, one man, sharp-eyed and relentless, stepped forward: Vladimir Lenin. He was not a romantic like Marx, nor a philosopher like Engels. He was something else entirely, a man who believed that ideas, to live, must take power. To him, compassion without structure was a dream too soft to survive. He wanted to turn belief into a system, theory into command. And so, under his direction, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, a moment both magnificent and tragic. The revolution that began with hope would soon learn how heavy the cost of change can be. Outside, the snow fell quietly over Russia. Inside, the world turned red. But this was not the red of hatred, not yet. It was the red of passion, of sacrifice, of a dream finally touching the earth. For the first time, workers claimed that they, too, were the state. The idea that had begun in dim factories and cafes now stood beneath the marble ceilings of palaces once ruled by kings. Across the world, hearts beat faster. The unthinkable had happened. The poor had seized history with their own hands. In Germany, in Hungary, in China, the same tremors began to spread. Some revolutions failed, others burned bright and vanished, but the world had already changed. The 20th century would no longer be written by monarchs. It would belong to movements, to the masses who believed they could rewrite destiny. Still, there was something fragile in that fire. Lenin's dream was not the same as Marx's, and after him came others, each with their own vision of how equality should look. Joseph Stalin would turn the revolution into a machine, precise and merciless. Mao Zedong would carry its echo across Asia, binding it to the struggle of peasants instead of factories. Each leader shaped socialism in their own image, bending an idea of love and fairness into something far harder to hold. History is strange like that. A dream can begin in tenderness and end in terror, depending on the hands that carry it. But if we look past the politics, past the parades, the slogans, the iron statues, we still find the human heart beating underneath. In every revolution, there were people who believed, sincerely, that they were building a world where no one would go hungry again. They gave their lives for that promise. And even if history later betrayed them, their hope remained something sacred. In the villages of Vietnam, young men and women fought with nothing but conviction. In the streets of Havana, crowds sang beneath the weight of American embargoes, still believing that justice was worth the cost. In every corner of the world, socialism became less of an ideology and more of a prayer whispered differently, but always about dignity. Yet, as the red banners rose higher, so did the shadows. To protect the revolution, leaders demanded obedience. To build equality, they took control. Fear became a tool as common as bread. The same system that once promised freedom began to close its doors. The dream of a world for all started to look like a world controlled by few again. And still, the people endured because belief is not so easily broken. In Moscow, in Beijing, in Havana, they sang songs about the dawn that one day the world would wake up fairer and kinder. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was illusion, but faith, even imperfect, gives the weary something to hold. If you walk today through Red Square, beneath the cold stones where Lenin still lies, you might feel something strange. Not fear, not glory, but sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from knowing how close humanity once came to building paradise, and how easily paradise can turn to dust. The revolutions of the 20th century didn't just change governments. They changed how we think about power itself. They taught us that ordinary people could move mountains, and that ideals, when corrupted, can crush them just as fast. The world that followed was divided in two, East and West, socialism and capitalism, red and blue. And in between them stretched a century of suspicion, of propaganda, of walls both concrete and invisible. But if we listen closely, under the noise of history, we can still hear the beginning, that small trembling whisper that said, "We can be better than this." That whisper had grown into thunder. Yes, but even thunder comes from clouds heavy with longing. The Russian Revolution, and all that followed, wasn't just a political story. It was a human one, a story of hope colliding with fear, of mercy lost to control, of what happens when ideas leave the heart and enter the machinery of power. And yet, without it, the world we know would not exist. The revolutions forced the West to change too, to look in the mirror, to build welfare systems, to soften capitalism's harsh edges. The Red Dawn may have frightened empires, but it also made them kinder. Perhaps that is the paradox of history. Even when a dream breaks, the pieces still shine. Tonight, as the city outside your window sleeps, think of those who believed enough to risk everything. The workers who stormed palaces with empty stomachs. The poets who traded ink for blood. The mothers who waited in long lines for bread, still whispering to their children that the world would someday be fair. They did not know that their dawn would also bring night, but still they believed. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, to dream even when you know the dream might burn. So as we close our eyes on this chapter, imagine the red flags not as symbols of war or ideology, but as flickers of that eternal human fire, the one that refuses to die, no matter how many times history tries to bury it. Because in every age, in every revolution, and in every heart that dares to hope, the same question returns soft as the wind at sunrise. Can we build a world that is both just and kind? The answer has never been simple, but the asking has changed everything. Every revolution begins with a promise, the promise of something better, cleaner, fairer. And when the dust of chaos settles, when the kings have fallen and the banners are raised, someone must ask the hardest question of all: now what? In the years after 1917, that question hung in the air like the echo of gunfire. The world's first socialist state, the Soviet Union, was born not from comfort, but from hunger, frost, and faith. It was a nation built on ashes, dreaming of equality while standing in ruins. But dreams, when forced into reality, have to find walls, streets, schools, laws, and suddenly, the infinite begins to shrink. Lenin once said that a revolution is not worth anything unless it can defend itself. And so, to defend the dream, they built systems. Systems that could plan, organize, decide not for one, but for all. The idea was beautiful in its simplicity. No one would go hungry again. No child would grow up illiterate. No man would live by exploiting another. For a time, it worked, or seemed to. Factories rose where fields once were. The countryside, long silent, was electrified. In the span of decades, the Soviet Union transformed from a feudal empire into an industrial giant. People learned to read. Women became engineers, doctors, pilots, to a world torn by depression and inequality. It looked as though the impossible had finally been done. The workers had built a modern civilization. But every miracle has its shadow. Behind the parades and the music, behind the shining posters and the smiling workers, something fragile began to crack. The state that promised to free everyone had also begun to fear everyone. Because when you build a utopia, you cannot allow chaos. And when you fear chaos, you begin to silence voices. In the name of order, censorship spread. In the name of unity, suspicion grew. And in the name of equality, individuality quietly disappeared. It was not always out of cruelty. Sometimes it was out of fear. Fear that the dream could collapse. Fear that one wrong move could destroy everything. Leaders believed they were protecting the revolution, even when they were strangling it. The line between idealism and tyranny blurred like breath on glass. Still, the dream didn't die. It changed shape. After World War II, socialism began to spread far beyond the cold streets of Moscow. In China, a man named Mao Zedong stood before millions and declared, "The Chinese people have stood up." In Eastern Europe, nations rebuilt themselves under the Red Star. In Cuba, young rebels toppled a dictator and promised to lift their island out of misery. Each of these revolutions was different, born from different wounds. In China, it was the hunger of peasants. In Cuba, the humiliation of foreign control. In Eastern Europe, the longing for safety after war. But all shared the same heartbeat, a desire to rewrite destiny. And for a moment, it felt as though history was tilting toward justice. Schools were built where none had existed. Land was divided among those who had never owned it. Millions learned to read, to think, to hope. For a generation, the word socialism carried not fear, but promise. Yet, somewhere along the way, the dream began to lose its tenderness. When you build a paradise by decree, paradise becomes another form of discipline. The walls that were meant to protect began to confine. The equality that once inspired began to demand obedience. Utopia, once imagined as a garden, started to feel like a maze. And still, even then, there was beauty. It would be too easy to say it all failed, because it didn't. It changed lives. It gave millions a voice, an education, a future they had never dared to imagine. It sent the first human into space. It taught the world that power could come from below, not above. But in chasing perfection, it forgot imperfection is what makes us human. Ordinary people learned to live between hope and fear. They whispered jokes about the government, shared bread during shortages, sang songs about freedom that no one dared record. And beneath the weight of slogans and portraits, they still found ways to love, to laugh, to dream quietly. Because even when ideology grows cold, the human heart keeps its warmth. From the outside, the West watched with fascination and dread. Some saw progress, others saw prison camps. Politicians spoke of the Iron Curtain, but behind that curtain were real families, real lives. People who believed that the world could be better, even as they struggled to breathe under their own ideals. In time, the cracks grew wider. The state could build rockets to the moon, but not enough bread for its people. The machines kept running, but the spirit that once fueled them began to fade. And when belief turns into fatigue, even the grandest systems begin to rust. By the 1980 seconds, the dream that once painted the sky red began to pale. It didn't collapse in a single night, but in countless quiet moments, an empty store, a whispered doubt, a sigh too long ignored. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it wasn't just concrete that crumbled. It was an idea that had tried to hold the weight of perfection. And yet, calling it a failure feels too easy, almost cruel, because for decades, socialism had done what few ideas ever could. It forced humanity to ask if compassion could be built into the bones of a nation. It gave birth to welfare states, inspired civil rights, reshaped economies far beyond its borders. Even those who opposed it were changed by it. That is the strange power of ideals. Even when they fall, they leave traces of light. Today, when we look back, we see the contradictions clearly. The same government that silenced poets also sent doctors to every village. The same system that feared freedom also taught millions to dream of a better world. History is never pure. It is always human, messy, tender, contradictory. Perhaps that's the lesson of the 20th century. You cannot build heaven without inviting a little hell. As the cold winds of time blew across the statues and slogans, people began to realize that no system, however noble, can replace the quiet work of empathy. Utopia cannot be imposed. It must be lived, one choice, one kindness at a time. And still, in certain corners of the world, the red star glows faintly, not as a symbol of power, but as a memory of those who believed that humanity could stand together, shoulder to shoulder, against the loneliness of the universe. Maybe that's all socialism ever truly wanted. Not dominance, not conquest, but connection. Because somewhere, even now, a teacher in a small village, a nurse in a crowded hospital, a worker standing up for their rights, they all carry a fragment of that dream. Not the system, not the slogans, just the belief that dignity is not a privilege, but a birthright. And that is what remains when utopia fades, not the walls, not the flags, but the whisper that began it all. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the West was changing too, not through war, but through reflection. As the world watched the rise of nations under red banners, something curious began to happen. Capitalism, once seen as untouchable, started to soften, to listen, and to learn. By the 1930 seconds, when the Great Depression swept across the United States, leaving millions jobless and homeless, the echo of socialist ideas began to sound within the very countries that had once rejected them. People realized that an economy built only on profit, one that forgot its people, would eventually collapse beneath the weight of its own indifference. In quiet rooms in Washington, in London, in Stockholm, policymakers began to speak of fairness, of things they once dismissed as leftist fantasies. They didn't call it socialism. They called it welfare. Not revolution, but reform. But the essence was the same. The world was learning to be gentler. In America, Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before the nation and promised a New Deal. He didn't speak of Marx, but the spirit was familiar. Jobs for the jobless, security for the elderly, and dignity for the poor. For the first time in modern history, a Western state openly declared that it had a moral responsibility for the happiness of its people. Across Europe, governments began laying the foundation for what would later be called the welfare state. From Scandinavia to Britain, from France to Germany, society slowly accepted a simple truth. A nation's strength is not measured by its output or its wealth, but by how it treats its weakest members. In many ways, the very existence of socialist nations made the capitalist world more humane. The West could no longer ignore its own workers when those across the curtain were promised equality. It could no longer praise freedom if that freedom belonged only to the rich. And so, out of fear of the red tide, the West rediscovered something deeper, the conviction that there can be no peace without justice. No one called it a victory for socialism. But quietly, it was. It was the kind of victory that doesn't show up in headlines, the kind that makes societies kinder. Look at Sweden in the 1950 seconds, a small nation that decided no one should be too rich while others went hungry. They taxed the wealthy heavily, but gave back in education, healthcare, and security. They didn't call it communism, they called it fairness. In post-war Britain, after the bombs stopped falling, people began to ask, if the government could mobilize millions to kill, why couldn't it mobilize them to care? Out of that question was born the National Health Service, the NHS, where rich and poor alike were treated as equals. And in America, even at the height of the Cold War, thinkers began to speak of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, but the right for everyone to dream. That belief sent Martin Luther King Jr. to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, speaking of a dream not defined by class or color, but by dignity. If we listen carefully, we can hear the strange beauty of the 20th century. While the world was divided in two, humanity was learning empathy. Socialism, though feared and condemned, slipped quietly into Western policies, into labor laws, into the moral vocabulary of an age. Neither side would ever admit it, but they shaped each other. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit, America answered not with missiles, but with schools. They invested in science, education, and healthcare, not only to compete, but to prove that capitalism, too, could care. And in that silent rivalry, humankind advanced faster than ever before. Two systems, two philosophies seemingly opposite pushed each other forward. One spoke of equality, the other of freedom. And between those echoes, the world began to understand that neither could survive without the other. Modern life, with its paid maternity leave, pensions, public schools, and universal healthcare, is the child of that hidden conversation. A dialogue born of fear, but ending in compassion. Of course, the West was never perfect. Inequality still lived in its shadows. Poverty never vanished completely. But something had changed. After a century of revolutions and wars, welfare was no longer seen as charity. It had become a human right. And that may be socialism's greatest legacy. It taught the world that fairness should not be a luxury, but a moral standard. It made those in power ask themselves, if we cannot hear the poor, do we deserve to lead? Today, in the bright cities of New York, London, and Paris, few think about the word socialism. Yet in every free public park, every public school, every ambulance that arrives on time, its shadow remains, no longer as an ideology, but as a habit of kindness. Perhaps that's how the most enduring ideas survive, not by keeping their names, but by becoming part of our nature. And maybe that's what makes history beautiful. It never truly belongs to the winners. Though capitalism triumphed and the Soviet Union fell, what endures is not who was right or wrong, but what humanity learned from both. In the darkness of war, we learned to love peace. In the fear of division, we learned to cooperate. And through rivalry, we discovered that no future is worth building if it leaves anyone behind. The 20th century has closed, but its echoes still hum beneath this one. When we speak of Social Security, Medicare, or universal education, we are not just speaking of policy, we are speaking of heritage, a heritage of listening. The West, in its own quiet way, learned from the East what Marx had written long ago. Man is truly free only when all are free. And so, history ceased to be a battle between two worlds and became a conversation between two souls, one speaking of reason, the other of compassion. Both, though different, remind us of the same truth. Humanity's greatest strength does not lie in markets or in armies, but in its ability to learn from its own mistakes. Perhaps that is the moment when civilization truly grew up, when the powerful finally learned to listen to the powerless. The world had learned to speak in whispers again. After the thunder of revolutions and the rebuilding of nations, the 20th century entered a strange quiet. the kind of silence that hums beneath fear. The Cold War had begun. It wasn't a war of armies, but of ideologies, of invisible walls and unspoken suspicions. There were no grand battlefields, no surrender ceremonies, only glances across oceans, listening stations hidden beneath mountains, and the ever-present hum of radio signals searching for meaning. The planet had been split in two, as if humanity itself had been divided between two dreams. One half believed in freedom through competition. The other believed in equality through control. And in between, billions of ordinary lives unfolded. Children growing up beneath propaganda posters, mothers queuing for food, or kissing their sons goodbye as they marched for flags they didn't choose. It was an age of contradictions, when fear disguised itself as peace, and peace was maintained through fear. In America, classrooms drilled children on how to duck and cover beneath their desks, as if wood could stop a nuclear blast. Across the ocean, Soviet children sang of glory and sacrifice, their voices trembling with both pride and obedience. Each side imagined the other as monsters, though both prayed, loved, and dreamed in the same human way. There was no single moment when the Cold War began. It was more like a slow freezing. The warmth that once connected nations turned brittle, until every gesture felt like a potential threat. The Berlin airlift, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the spy exchanges on foggy bridges, all tiny fractures in a world that could shatter at any moment. And yet, for all its tension, this frozen era produced an odd kind of beauty. Because when people live with constant fear of death, they start to value life in quieter, deeper ways. Art flourished. Literature bloomed. Behind the walls, poets wrote in secret. Painters captured the ache of longing. And musicians from Moscow to Memphis composed songs that sounded like prayers disguised as melodies. The world was divided politically, but emotionally, it was beginning to share the same heartache. In Eastern Europe, whispers of dissent grew not as riots, but as conversations in kitchens, over bread and tea, when someone dared to say, "It can't go on like this." In the West, the counterculture rose. Young people, burning draft cards, holding hands at peace rallies, and singing that all they needed was love. Two sides, different slogans, yet both searching for the same thing, meaning in a world ruled by fear. Nations were racing to space, building rockets that could destroy the Earth or touch the stars, and no one seemed sure which destiny would come first. When Yuri Gagarin looked down from orbit and said, "I see no borders," the irony was almost unbearable. From above, humanity was one, but below, it was more divided than ever. Even as governments built bombs, families built lives. In Moscow, couples walked hand in hand along the frozen river. In New York, lovers kissed beneath the glow of Times Square. Ordinary people continued to fall in love, to raise children, to dream of a tomorrow that might never come. And perhaps that was the quiet rebellion of the Cold War, the refusal to stop living. Still, every kindness came with a shadow. In the Soviet bloc, suspicion seeped into daily life. Friends could be informants. Words could be crimes. In America, paranoia turned neighbors into enemies as the Red Scare spread through television screens and courtrooms. Freedom, the West's greatest virtue, began to taste of fear too. The world was a mirror, each side reflecting the other's anxieties. The Soviets feared corruption. The Americans feared infiltration. Both feared losing control, not realizing that control was the very thing draining them of humanity. But amidst that frost, small acts of warmth glowed like candles. Writers like Solzhenitsyn risked prison to tell the truth. Musicians smuggled forbidden jazz records across borders. Scientists from opposing sides met in quiet conferences, sharing discoveries that might save lives even if their countries forbade it. The Cold War was not just about weapons, it was also about the fragile persistence of empathy. Somewhere in the middle of it all stood Berlin, half free, half captive, a scar across Europe. At night, the wall gleamed under searchlights, separating families, lovers, entire lives. Yet even there, hope found cracks to grow through. People built tunnels. Some floated across rivers on makeshift rafts. A few risked everything for one embrace on the other side. The wall tried to divide a city, but it could never truly divide love. And while leaders gave speeches about supremacy, the people on both sides learned a truth their governments never taught them: that fear is exhausting. It consumes nations the way cold consumes light, slowly, silently, until warmth feels like a memory. By the 1970s, something began to change. The ice, though thick, started to melt. Small agreements were signed. American presidents visited Moscow. Soviet leaders smiled for cameras in Washington. It was diplomacy, yes, but also fatigue. Humanity was simply tired of holding its breath. Still, beneath the smiles, the fear remained. The nuclear stockpiles grew higher, the rhetoric louder. But something deeper was stirring. A generation born into this stalemate was starting to imagine life beyond it. Artists painted without permission. Citizens protested without knowing if they'd be arrested. They had lived their whole lives in the shadow of apocalypse, and suddenly, they decided to stop being afraid. The collapse didn't come with explosions, but with sighs. It wasn't a battle that ended the Cold War, it was exhaustion. The Soviet Union, drained from within, quietly unraveled. The walls fell, not from bombs, but from disbelief. Disbelief that they were ever necessary at all. When Berliners climbed the wall in 1989, dancing and crying and breaking stone with their bare hands, it wasn't just a political victory. It was a spiritual one, proof that even after decades of division, humanity's instinct is always toward reunion. On that night, strangers embraced like long-lost family. Soldiers laid down rifles to help people climb. The air was cold, but it felt like spring. And just like that, the world woke up to silence, not the fearful silence of the past, but the stunned, sacred quiet that follows relief. Yet, the end of the Cold War did not mean the end of walls. Some became invisible lines of wealth, technology, or belief. The world didn't heal overnight, but something inside it shifted. The old certainties, east and west, right and wrong, us and them, began to blur. For the first time in generations, people started to imagine a future not defined by sides. Looking back now, the Cold War feels almost unreal. A half-century where humanity stood at the edge of self-destruction and somehow stepped back. It reminds us that progress is not just invention or ambition, but restraint, to the courage to stop when you could destroy. And in that long, frozen century, amid spies and speeches and endless tension, perhaps the most powerful force of all was not ideology, but empathy. Because while governments fought for supremacy, ordinary people kept the world human with letters sent across oceans, songs shared through radio static, and tiny acts of kindness that defied entire empires. In the end, the Cold War wasn't just a story of conflict. It was a story of survival, of how the human spirit learned to live under threat, to love in silence, and to hope in secret. Perhaps that's what makes this chapter of history so haunting. It wasn't about who won or lost, but about what it meant to endure, to stay soft in a hard world. And as the last walls came down, the world seemed to whisper again, as it once did in the factories of the 19th century. Maybe we can be better than this. That whisper, persistent and gentle, survived every ideology, every fear, every wall. And perhaps that's the most enduring legacy of all. The reminder that even through the coldest silences, the human heart keeps speaking. When empires fall, they rarely do so in thunder. They fade slowly, painfully, like a star losing its light. For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union had called itself the heart of a new world. But by the 1980s, that heart was tired. It still beat, but unevenly, like a song out of rhythm. People queued for bread that never came. Factories still roared, but their machines were decades old. The red flags still fluttered, but the faith beneath them had begun to fray. In a way, it wasn't collapse that was approaching, it was disillusionment, that quiet kind of death that begins in the soul long before the body falls. No one noticed at first. The statues still stood. The parades still marched, but the faces in the crowd no longer smiled the same. Behind the songs and slogans, there was a silence too deep to ignore, a silence that said, "We no longer believe." By the late 1980s, even the leaders could feel it. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last man to hold the Soviet dream in his hands, tried to open the windows. He called it glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. The words sounded fresh, full of hope, but they carried the desperation of someone trying to breathe life back into a flame that had already burned itself out. For 70 years, the Soviet Union had tried to build paradise from the ground up. And in many ways, it had done the impossible. It had turned illiterate peasants into scientists, sent a man to space, defeated the Nazis, and turned a poor nation into a global superpower. But somewhere along the way, the cost became unbearable. When everything belongs to everyone, sometimes it ends up belonging to no one at all. The promises of equality had hardened into bureaucracy. The dream of unity had turned into control. The system that once sought to protect people from hunger now protected itself from truth. And truth, like sunlight, always finds a way in. So it began to crumble not with explosions, but with exhaustion. In 1986, when the reactor at Chernobyl exploded, the Soviet Union tried to hide it, as it had hidden so many things. But the radiation didn't obey politics. It drifted across borders, invisible but undeniable. And in doing so, it revealed something far more toxic than nuclear fallout: the decay of trust. People stopped believing in the story they were told. They saw that the empire wasn't made of steel and ideology, but of fear and fatigue. And fear, once named, begins to disappear. By 1989, the satellite states of Eastern Europe began to slip away one by one, like children quietly leaving home. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, each with its own story of courage. A student with a sign, a mother whispering freedom to her child, a soldier refusing to shoot. The Berlin Wall fell, and with it, the illusion that walls could ever protect ideas. When the Soviet Union itself dissolved 2 years later, it wasn't a violent end. It was a sigh, the long exhale of a people who had held their breath for too long. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin on a cold December night in 1991. No gunfire, no marching bands, no proclamations, just silence. Moscow was covered in snow, and for a moment, it felt as if history itself had paused to listen. What was left behind was more complicated than victory or defeat. It was something quieter, a reckoning. For some, it felt like liberation. For others, like loss. Many woke up the next morning and realized that the world they had lived in all their lives, the slogans, the schools, the songs, had vanished overnight. They were free, yes, but free to do what? To buy? To dream? To start again? Freedom, after all, is a gift that comes without instructions. Across the former Soviet republics, capitalism arrived like a storm, fast, wild, and merciless. Some became rich overnight. Others lost everything. The certainty of yesterday gave way to the chaos of tomorrow. Supermarkets were filled again, but hearts remained empty. The people who had once built a country for everyone were now learning to compete against each other. And yet, amid the confusion, something beautiful flickered: an honesty that had long been missing. People could finally speak. Artists painted without fear. Journalists wrote what they saw, not what they were told. The air, though cold, carried the scent of truth. But truth, too, has its price. When the curtain lifted, the world saw the scars, the prisons, the famines, the lies, whispered as law. It was painful, almost unbearable, like waking from a long dream and realizing how much of your life had been imagined. Still, no dream, however flawed, leaves the world untouched. The fall of the Soviet Union did not erase its achievements, the literacy, the science, the victories over fascism, but it revealed the fragility of ideals when they lose touch with humanity. It was proof that no system, however grand, can survive if it forgets to love the people it claims to serve. And as one star faded, the rest of the world felt the darkness too. The balance of fear that had defined the century was gone. The world suddenly had only one superpower, one ideology. And without its rival, capitalism began to run unchecked, wild and unopposed. In the vacuum left by the fallen empire, greed grew louder, faster, more confident. It's strange, isn't it? The moment one dream dies, another begins to devour the sky. The West celebrated the end of history, but history, patient as ever, only smiled. Because history never ends, it simply changes its voice. The lesson of the Soviet collapse was not that socialism failed, nor that capitalism triumphed, but that both are human inventions, and anything human carries both light and shadow. The Soviet experiment was born from compassion, but hardened by control. The capitalist dream was born from freedom, but consumed by excess. In the end, they were mirrors reflecting each other's weaknesses. And maybe that's the real tragedy, not that one system lost, but that both forgot the simple truth that had begun it all. That progress without kindness is just another form of tyranny. Even now, decades later, the ghosts of that fallen empire linger. You can see them in the abandoned factories of Siberia, in the faded murals of workers holding hammers and wheat, in the weary eyes of those who remember when everything felt certain, even if that certainty was a lie. But you can also find something else there, resilience. The quiet strength of a people who have learned to rebuild, not once, but many times. Their songs are softer now, but truer. Their laughter, when it comes, feels earned. Perhaps that's the paradox of collapse. It destroys illusions, but it also gives birth to honesty. It takes away grandeur, but returns humanity. And maybe, after all, that's what the world needed, a reminder that no ideology, no nation, no star can shine forever, but the light it leaves can guide us still. When the Soviet flag was folded for the last time, an old man standing in Red Square was asked what he felt. He looked at the sky for a long moment and said, "It's strange. We built a heaven for the future, and in doing so, forgot to live in the present." Those words might be the epitaph of the 20th century. We are still, in many ways, living in its aftermath, surrounded by its inventions, its ruins, its echoes. But perhaps as the dust settled, the world began to understand something essential, that dreams must breathe, that systems must bend, that no paradise is worth building if it costs our humanity. The star that once rose over the east has fallen, but its light remains in ways few expected. In the welfare systems, it inspired. In the social movements, it awakened. In the millions of ordinary people who still believe that compassion belongs in politics. The Soviet Union is gone, but the question it asks still lingers, soft and eternal. Can we build a fair world without losing our souls? Maybe that question is the true inheritance of that fallen star. Not its power, not its empire, but its longing, the stubborn human desire to make tomorrow kinder than today. And if you listen carefully, somewhere in the cold wind over Moscow, or in the hum of a city far away, you might still hear it, that quiet heartbeat of a dream that refused to die completely. Because history, like the night sky, never loses its stars. Some simply shine from further away. The dust of the 20th century has finally settled. The red flags have faded. The walls have fallen. And yet somehow the ideas never truly disappeared. They changed shape, softened, drifted quietly into the rhythm of modern life. What was once shouted in manifestos now hums in hospitals, in classrooms, in laws written not for profit, but for people. It is strange, isn't it? How an idea that once divided the world now hides in plain sight? You can hear its echo not in the speeches of politicians, but in the laughter of children who go to school for free, in the heartbeat of a patient who receives care without a bill, in the dignity of an old man who lives his last years unafraid of hunger. That is the gentlest victory of all the kind that doesn't need parades. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many thought socialism had died. The West proclaimed the end of history, the triumph of markets and democracy. But history, like water, finds its own paths. The language of ideology may have faded, yet the longing that gave it birth, fairness, empathy, community remained. Look closely, and you'll see it everywhere. In Scandinavia, where governments tax the rich not out of envy, but out of a shared belief that no one should fall through the cracks. In Germany, where workers sit beside executives on corporate boards, because decisions that shape lives should include the voices of those who live them. In Canada, where a sick child receives treatment simply because she is human, these things do not call themselves socialism. They call themselves decency. Perhaps that is the most profound transformation of all, that an idea once feared has become ordinary, almost invisible, woven into the texture of daily life. The right to education, the right to health care. The idea that a job should pay enough to live, that aid should come with security, that a nation's worth is measured not by its wealth, but by its compassion. Each of these began as radical dreams. Now they are expectations. But the world did not arrive here peacefully. Every right we take for granted was fought for by those who believed society could be kinder. The teachers who struck for fair pay. The nurses who worked through exhaustion so that no patient would die alone. The activists who faced prisons and bullets for the belief that dignity should not depend on luck. They were not building a new system. They were nurturing an old hope. And so, while the 20th century was the age of ideology, the 21st may be the age of empathy. Of course, inequality still lives among us. Technology has given us speed but not always wisdom. Billionaires rise as easily as kings once did, and poverty has found new disguises in rent, in debt, in quiet despair. But unlike a century ago, the world can no longer pretend it doesn't see. Social justice has entered our language, our art, our conscience. Young people march again, not beneath red banners, but beneath signs that say, climate justice, equal pay, Black Lives Matter. They speak a new dialect of the same dream, that the future must belong to everyone, not a few. The ideas have grown softer, yes, but also wiser. They no longer speak of revolution, they speak of reform. They no longer divide the world into sides, but invite everyone to sit at the same table. The dream that once tried to rule the world now simply asks to make it livable. Sometimes, when people hear the word socialism, they still imagine the ghosts of failed empires. But perhaps that is because we have forgotten that socialism was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a mirror. A mirror that asked, how much suffering are we willing to accept as normal? That question still matters. When a corporation chooses sustainability over profit, when a city opens shelters instead of building walls, when a community garden grows between two towers of glass, those are quiet answers to that old question. They are acts of kindness, disguised as policy. Even in the United States, where the word socialism once sounded like treason, the spirit of it has found gentle ways to return. Public libraries, food programs, the idea that college should not bankrupt a lifetime. These are not revolutions. They are restorations, attempts to bring the heart back into a system that too often forgets it has one. It's easy to dismiss such gestures as small, but history teaches us that tenderness is never small. A century ago, a whisper about equality built movements that shook the world. Who's to say a whisper of compassion cannot do the same? Perhaps that is the real inheritance of all that struggle. Not the rise or fall of nations, but the understanding that we are, all of us, bound by one fragile thread: care. We care for our families, for our neighbors, for strangers we will never meet. And when that care becomes public, when it moves from heart to policy, it changes the shape of civilization. It makes economies humane, politics patient, and progress purposeful. Even now, the echoes continue in places far from power. In a small village, a doctor who charges nothing. In a refugee camp, volunteers who build schools out of scraps. In a factory, a worker who shares his lunch with someone poorer. These are the new faces of an old faith, the belief that helping one another is not charity, but responsibility. Maybe that is what socialism has become. Not a government, but a habit of kindness. Not a flag, but a quiet rhythm in the heart of modern life. And maybe that is how all great ideas survive, not by ruling, but by reminding. When we look at the 21st century, with its climate crises, automation, and inequality that spans continents, it is tempting to feel overwhelmed. But history offers comfort. Every time humanity has drifted too far into greed or cruelty, something gentle has pulled it back. A voice, a movement, a memory. The spirit of socialism, stripped of dogma, is that voice. It reminds us that progress without compassion is hollow, that technology without empathy is just noise. It whispers, as it always has, that the measure of a civilization is not how high it builds, but how many it lifts. Maybe one day the word itself will disappear, and that will be its final victory. Because when fairness becomes instinct, when generosity becomes ordinary, when no child has to learn the word poverty, then the dream will have done its work and can rest. Until then, it lives quietly among us, in every vote for justice, in every law that protects rather than punishes, in every person who chooses care over convenience. And tonight, as the lights of the cities shimmer like distant constellations, perhaps we can imagine the world that so many once tried and failed to build. Not perfect, not pure, just kind enough. If tonight's journey touched you, stay a little longer. Let's keep wandering together through the echoes of time, finding light in all the forgotten places. Subscribe if you wish, not for numbers, but for company. Because History After Sunset isn't just a channel, it's a quiet corner for dreamers who still believe the past can make the future gentler. Until we meet again, good night, my friend, and may you sleep with peace in your heart and a little piece of history in your soul.